Now, what's unfortunate is that those viruses are more powerful and more dangerous than HIV/AIDS, because these viruses mutate very, very quickly. And by the time you figure out a vaccine for one variation, the virus is mutated and you're hit again. So using that metaphor, we have to find ways of continually developing vaccines against undemocratic behavior, vaccines against the loss of freedom, vaccines against the denigration of the human spirit. We must create these vaccines, and then we must find ways to quickly distribute them. Bunche would say, using that metaphor, that is precisely what international institutions, based on straight sticks, declarations of human rights, and other principles, that in fact is the way forward. Prepare your next generation to improve that kind of performance. Now, Bunche was attacked for being not quite a communist, but this notion of supporting the UN meant that he wasn't proud to be an American. And Bunche's response then is as relevant today. What does it mean to be proud to be an American? And why do some believe that supporting a strong UN automatically means weakening the United States? Pride, according to Bunche, is based upon, our pride should be based upon those principles and practices enshrined in our current Constitution that promote common welfare, democracy, equality before the law, along with a Bill of Rights that protects such freedoms as speech, assembly, and religion. Bunche was so proud of these promises that he wanted to spread their effects and practices to all corners of the globe. He believed that the United Nations represents an important vehicle for accomplishing that goal. While the UN has its flaws and areas for improvement, an alternative arena for spreading freedom and democracy that is truly inclusive and reflective of the diversity of humankind and the village I described, that does not exist, an alternative. Those who argue that a strong UN necessarily leads to a weakened US have their logic wrong. The exact reverse is true. Bunche would say that if you're concerned with homeland security in the United States, it has less to do with combating weapons of mass destruction and terrorists. Rather, homeland security should be the strengthening of the institutions and practices of freedom and democracy. The greatest defense of freedom and democracy is its practice. That means removing obstacles to voter participation, eliminating social discrimination and unfair treatment. And you should know that the emergence of domestic terrorists leads to the kind of abuse of the Liberty Seven. Who are the Liberty Seven? It's 7 young black boys in Liberty City in Florida that the FBI and Homeland Security people overheard them talking about being a revolutionary, being a terrorist, and proceeded to entrap them, and then arrested them as the latest terrorists. And it was so outrageous that eventually they had to drop the cause. But what leads to that kind of confusion and logic, what leads us to that is this notion that somehow or another, security is based on force and the ability to compel rather than impel people towards more fair and equitable treatment. Now, in 1940, Bunche was asked what were his wishes for the Negro. The Harlem newspaper asked him, and his first wish for the Negro: I wish that the American Negro would become more involved in international affairs instead of just being complacent about his local problem. We who are African Americans, obviously we must strive to place our problems in perspective. We must stop dwelling on the unpleasant things of life so that we can focus on what can be and what should be. We must recall that the faces of hundreds of thousands of nameless people who preceded us and who prepared the way for our progress demand that we not wallow in whine. We have an obligation to become role models who will not allow the grievous and slow-healing wounds of racial oppression to fester within us and then consume us with self-hatred and self-destruction. Ever mindful of those conditions of cruel and unjust punishment, our African ancestors remained hopeful and diligent in the pursuit of freedom and dignity. In their memory, we have no excuse for failing to advance the next generation. Now, when Bunche wished that we would become more involved in international affairs, he understood something very profound. If you have the capacity to imagine yourself in the place of the other, no matter how strange that person is, if you have the capacity to imagine yourself in that person's place, and you work to alleviate suffering, you will benefit in two ways, at least two ways. First of all, you will feel better about yourself, your dignity and self-respect. You will also begin to fashion alliances with the, quote, stranger, who may become an unexpected ally in your struggle to alleviate your suffering. Indeed, sometimes a prophet has no honor in his own country. Sometimes you must go abroad to validate yourself in your own community. And finally, moving from a focus on self-interest towards one of common interest ennobles us as human beings. Bunche believed that the loss of self-respect and self-dignity leads to the death of the soul. If our minds and bodies are controlled by the limbic and neocortex systems of the brain, then what happens to us when those systems go haywire? What happens when our unchecked emotions of hatred, bigotry, and fear lead to acts of violence, lynching, or the killing of innocent women and children? What happens when our unchecked logic leads to so-called rational solutions such as slavery and the World War II Holocaust? These behaviors may be the result of the failure of a master system that regulates both the limbic, the feelings, and the neocortex, the rational thought systems of the brain. Some would call that master system the spiritual dimension of human existence. That master system degenerates when the individual no longer respects himself and therefore no longer respects the other. Equally, the absence of honor and respect for oneself quickly leads to the dishonor and disrespect of the other. When these conditions surface or obtain, the soul dies. Lastly, Bunche would offer certain prescriptions for living in a global village that I just described. And the first prescription would be consult, 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 and then consult. Then act, then consult. But it's a collective action. It begins by saying, how do we include others in our discussion? How do we become more inclusive? And then it goes immediately to the question, what are we going to do as opposed to what am I going to do? The issues that we confront today of how do we get along, those are the issues that are embedded in that village of 100 that I talked about. And how do we prepare ourselves to be able to wrestle with those issues in such a way that we make choices that enhances the human spirit, increases freedom and democracy? That is the challenge. And that is what successor generations deserve to be prepared. If we do not do what we have to do to prepare them, then it is we who have let them down.